But in the early 1960s, a wave of decolonization swept across the African continent. Dakar to Niamey, Bamako to Yaoundé. French flags were lowered, national anthems were sung, and 14 newly independent nations celebrated the end of French imperial rule. In the history textbooks, this moment is recorded as a triumph of sovereignty, a clean break from decades of colonial extraction. You were taught that France packed up its military garrisons, handed over the keys of government, and allowed its former colonies to chart their own destiny. If you turn away from the ceremonial plazas, oft inside the central bank, ledgers of Paris, a far colder, more calculated financial reality emerges. When the French administrative offices closed, the master key to 14 national economies was never handed over. Quietly moved to a heavy steel vault inside the French Treasury at Rue de Bercy. On December 26, 1945, General Charles de Gaulle signed a decree establishing a colonial currency known as the franc CFA. 80 years later, 14 African nations, housing over 180 million people, all use a currency whose notes are printed in a small town in central France, whose exchange rate is fixed by European bankers, and whose national reserves are legally bound to the French Ministry of Finance. This is not a story of missed economic opportunities, poor post-independence management. This is the story of an invisible financial empire. An empire built not with iron chains or colonial governors, guided with credit lines, not mandatory reserve deposits, Avita votes in central bank boardrooms, covert monetary warfare. While the world believed France had surrendered its empire, Paris simply converted its territorial holdings into a permanent financial pipeline. Understand how 14 sovereign nations lost control of their own money, you have to travel back to the ruined balance sheets of post-war Paris in 1945. At the end of World War II, France was economically shattered. Its infrastructure was destroyed, while its gold reserves were drained. That is, the French franc was plummeting in value against the US dollar under the newly established Bretton Woods system. France devalued its currency to survive. The cost of importing raw materials from its vast African empire would skyrocket, causing hyperinflation in Paris. The solution devised by de Gaulle's financial ministers was as brilliant as it was predatory. France created a separate monetary zone for the colonies, establishing the CFA Franc, which originally stood for Colonies Françaises d'Afrique. Currency was artificially overvalued against the metropolitan French franc. This was framed as a benevolent gift to shield the colonies from post-war inflation. In reality, it was a structural trap designed to starve local African industries and guarantee a captive market for French manufacturing. As the CFA franc was artificially strong, local African agricultural goods and raw minerals became too expensive to export to independent global markets like the United States or Germany. At the same time, French manufactured goods, cars, stationery, textiles became artificially cheap for African consumers to buy. African farmers could not build local processing factories, as importing equipment required foreign exchange that Paris strictly controlled. Instead, African nations were forced into a raw material extraction loop. They exported cheap cocoa, coffee, timber, and cotton directly to France, and imported expensive finished goods back from Paris. By setting the monetary rules in 1945, France ensured that its colonies could never build an independent industrial base. The monetary zone locked the empire into a permanent supplier of cheap resources for the French economic recovery. Creating a colonial currency during an era of empire was standard practice. The true test of French financial engineering came in 1960, when the wind of African nationalism made formal empire impossible to maintain. Hobson, faced with mounting international pressure and armed independence movements, Paris realized that holding territories by military force was becoming too costly. The French strategist Jacques Foccart, chief advisor to President Charles de Gaulle, tasked with designing a new architecture. The system would come to be known as Françafrique. The strategy was simple: grant the colonies their flags, abolish from their national anthems, and their seats at the United Nations, but forced them to sign bilateral cooperation agreements before independence was officially recognized. These secret pacts were divided into three non-negotiable pillars. First, military treaties, allowing France to maintain permanent military bases in strategic capitals and intervene to protect friendly regimes. Second, strategic resource rights, granting French corporations, like Total and Orano, absolute right of first refusal over any newly discovered oil, uranium, or mineral deposits. Third, the absolute master pillar, monetary integration through the CFA Franc. Under these treaties, newly independent nations had to agree to surrender their monetary sovereignty in exchange for French financial guarantees. If an African leader refused to sign the monetary pact, independence was denied, administrative aid was cut off, intelligence services were deployed to engineer political collapse. Independence was granted on paper. The keys to the national treasuries remained locked inside the banking halls of Paris. At the absolute center of this invisible empire lies a technical financial mechanism known as the operations account, Compte d'operations. On this day, most history books omit this single account, yet it represents one of the most sophisticated mechanisms of financial extraction ever devised. Under the rules of the CFA monetary agreements, two regional African central banks, BCEO in West Africa and BAC in Central Africa, were legally forced to deposit their national foreign exchange reserves directly into the French Treasury. In the early decades, the environment was staggering. African nations had to deposit up to 85% of all their foreign currency earnings, every dollar, every mark, every yen earned from selling oil, cocoa, and gold, into a special account managed by the Ministry of Finance in Paris. Under intense diplomatic pressure, this figure was reduced to 65%, and later to 50%. Consider the mechanics of this system. Ivory Coast sold cocoa to the United States and received US dollars. Those dollars did not go to Abidjan. They were transferred directly to the French Treasury in Paris, where they were converted into French francs, and later euros, at a fixed rate. The French Treasury then gave the African central banks a credit entry on paper. If an African nation wanted to buy foreign machinery from Japan or medicine from Germany, it had to ask permission from the French Treasury to convert its own reserves back into foreign currency. To make matters worse, France maintained structural veto power on the boards of both African central banks. French representatives sat in every major monetary policy meeting, holding the legal authority to block any credit expansion, any interest rate adjustment, or any loan that did not align with French financial interests. Furthermore, the French Treasury took those billions of dollars in African foreign reserves and invested them in international money markets and French government bonds. Paris was effectively using the hard currency reserves of some of the poorest nations on earth to subsidize its own national debt, stabilize its own balance of payments, and fund its own public services. Imagine a bank where you are forced to deposit half of your earnings, pay a fee to access your own money, give the bank director veto power over your household budget, and watch the bank use your savings to pay off its own mortgage. That is the exact mechanism of the operations account. When visionary African leaders realized that the CFA franc was a permanent leash around the neck of their national sovereignty, they tried to break free. The history of post-independence Africa is littered with the political corpses of those who challenged the currency empire of Paris. Consider the tragedy of Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of Togo. Olympio was a brilliant British-educated economist who understood that Togo could never develop while bound to the CFA franc. In 1962, Olympio passed legislation through the Togolese parliament to establish an independent central bank and issue a new national currency, the Togolese franc. He ordered the notes printed, set up the foreign exchange reserves, and scheduled the official currency launch for January 1963. 3 days before Togo was set to issue its own money, Olympio was assassinated outside the U.S. Embassy in Lomé by a group of French-trained military officers led by Gnassingbé Eyadema. After the newly printed Togolese currency was burned, Togo was forced back into the CFA franc zone, Alain Adema ruled the country as a pro-French dictator for 38 years. In Mali, President Modibo Keïta took a similar path. In 1962, Keïta announced that Mali was withdrawing from the CFA Franc zone to protect its domestic economy from capital flight. The response from French intelligence was swift and devastating, launching a covert operation known as Opération Persil. The French Secret Service printed billions of counterfeit Malian francs in high-security printing facilities in France. French agents then smuggled crates of these fake banknotes across the borders into Mali, flooding the local markets. Within months, the Malian economy was paralyzed by hyperinflation. The local currency collapsed, and civil unrest swept the country. In 1968, Modibo Keïta was overthrown in a military coup, and Mali was forced to surrender its monetary independence, running to the CFA Franc fold. Finally, when Ahmed Sékou Touré famously voted no to de Gaulle's French community in 1958, French administrators withdrew within 48 hours. As they left, they destroyed official documents, piled light bulbs from government buildings, concrete down sewage pipes, and destroyed medical supplies. When Sékou Touré issued an independent Guinean currency, French intelligence deployed Opération Persil once again, flooding Guinea with fake notes until the economy imploded. The message sent from Paris to every African capital was clear: you may change your president, you may change your parliament, but if you touch the currency, your government will fall. For decades, the monetary status quo was maintained through a combination of fear, elite co-optation, and military presence. However, at the turn of the century, a major shift in European geopolitics threatened to disrupt the invisible empire. In 1999, France surrendered its national currency, the French franc, to join the European Monetary Union and adopt the euro. Many African economists believed this would be the natural end of the CFA franc. After all, how could a colonial currency tied to the French franc survive when the French franc itself ceased to exist? Instead of dismantling the system, Dutch diplomats quietly negotiated a special agreement with the European Central Bank. CFA franc was officially pegged to the euro at a fixed rate of €1 to 655.957 CFA francs. The European Central Bank agreed to allow the French Treasury, not the ECB itself, to continue guaranteeing the convertibility of the CFA franc. This structural shift locked West and Central Africa into an overvalued European currency framework. As the euro is backed by the massive industrial output of Germany and Northern Europe, it is an extremely strong currency. For a developing African nation, tied to a currency as strong as the euro is economic poison. It makes African raw material exports expensive on the international market, while encouraging the importation of luxury European consumer goods. Local African manufacturers cannot compete with cheap European imports entering their duty-free markets. At the same time, as the currency is pegged to the euro, African central banks are forced to maintain high interest rates and tight credit policies to maintain the peg, preventing local entrepreneurs from securing affordable business loans. African economies were starved of credit. French corporations enjoyed unprecedented dominance over strategic resource extraction. Consider the case of Niger, one of the poorest countries on the planet according to the United Nations Human Development Index. For over 50 years, French state-controlled nuclear giant extracted thousands of tons of high-grade uranium from the desert mines of Arlit in northern Niger. This uranium was shipped directly to France. It powered 56 nuclear reactors, lighting over 70% of France's domestic electricity, and lighting one in every 3 light bulbs across the French Republic. Yet, in Niger, over 80% of the population had no access to electricity, lighting their homes with kerosene lamps while living above the very fuel that powered light in Paris. As Niger used the CFA franc, its foreign currency earnings from uranium sales were routed straight through the French Treasury, allowing Paris to set the price of uranium far below international market rates for decades. The same pattern repeated in Gabon and Cameroon with crude oil, in Ivory Coast with cocoa, and in Senegal with port concessions managed by French logistics empires like Bolloré. The CFA franc was never a monetary tool for African development. It was an extractive mechanism designed to lock in resource access and prevent structural industrialization. After 80 years of silent financial drain, Compte finally broke where Paris least expected, in the military barracks of the Sahel. Between 2021 and 2024, a political earthquake shook West Africa. A series of military coups swept through Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, overthrowing pro-French civilian governments. As from, unlike previous coups, these movements were backed by massive popular demonstrations in the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. Young Africans, who make up over 60% of the population, took to the streets not just to demand political change, turn French flags and stomp on CFA Franc banknotes. The military governments formed a new regional alliance known as the Alliance of Sahel States. They expelled French military garrisons on French state media outlets, canceled mining concessions with French corporations, and announced their intention to abandon the CFA franc to create a shared independent currency. Panicked by the rapid collapse of its geopolitical sphere of influence, Paris tried to engineer a preemptive reform. In 2019, French President Emmanuel Macron stood alongside Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara in Abidjan and announced a historic reform of the West African CFA franc. Under this proposed change, currency would be renamed the ECO. France agreed to withdraw its representatives from the board of the regional central bank and stop requiring the deposit of 50% of foreign reserves into the French Treasury. Casual observers of this appeared to be the final end of French monetary imperialism. But when independent financial analysts read the fine print of the treaty, the illusion crumbled. Housed eco-currency would still be strictly pegged to the euro at a fixed rate. The French Treasury would still remain the ultimate financial guarantor of the currency. And if a balance of payments crisis occurred, obligation to deposit reserves back into Paris would automatically be reactivated. As a classic French diplomatic maneuver, change the name, repaint the logo of the visible advisors, thus keep the underlying financial engine completely intact. The story of the CFA franc forces us to confront a fundamental truth about modern history. We are taught that empires end when flags are lowered, constitutions are written, and when foreign armies march home. However, we are taught to view the world through political borders and diplomatic protocols. But if you want to see where power truly resides, you must ignore the speeches and follow the money. Colonization in French Africa was not a triumph of freedom. It was a corporate restructuring. France traded the high administrative costs of direct colonial rule for the frictionless efficiency of a central bank monopoly. Allowed 14 nations to assume the liabilities of statehood, paying for schools, roads, and police forces, while retaining control over the single asset that makes statehood viable, the sovereign power to issue money and control credit. For 80 years, millions of young Africans have been forced to migrate across dangerous sea routes to Europe in search of economic opportunity, completely unaware that the financial stagnation of their homelands was engineered decades ago inside the vault of Rue de Bercy. The currency empire of France was built in the dark, but maintained by secret treaties, unenforced by economic sabotage. And as the people of the Sahel demonstrate today, an empire built on a monetary illusion can only survive as long as the victims remain blind to the ledger.